Paul, we were meant on the previous forecast to borrow just over 55 billion this financial year. It's now going to be 68, he says. Next year we were meant to borrow just under 39 billion. It's now going to be 59 billion. And so it goes on. Is this deterioration in our fiscal position worse than you thought it would be?
I mean, actually, I think the OBR has been relatively optimistic compared, for example, with the Bank of England. So the OBR's figures up to 2019-20 look a bit more optimistic rather than more pessimistic.
On the growth side.
On the growth side, and therefore on the public finances side. In terms of the public finances overall, their numbers are actually very close to the numbers that we put out a couple of weeks ago in terms of our expectations of borrowing going forward.
If they're a bit more optimistic on the growth side, and they may not be optimistic enough, time will tell, why does the borrowing deteriorate by so much? I mean, it's almost 20 billion behind where it was for the next couple of years.
Well, there's two things going on. First is that borrowing is actually very sensitive to growth, so those aren't terribly surprising relationships. The other thing is that there is clearly, as the OBR state, there are other things going on which are creating problems, and in particular over this year, the Chancellor has got in less in income tax revenues than he expected to do, even given what's happened to growth and wages and so on. And one of the things that the OBR draw attention to, and indeed the Chancellor mentioned he was going to consult on, is this whole issue of what you might call the gig economy, but people who are no longer getting money as earnings, as PAYE earnings, but instead are self-employed or incorporating. And if you're self-employed, and particularly if you call yourself a small company, you pay quite a bit less tax than if you're an employee for the same amount of income. Something the OBR worried about in March. They seem to be worrying about it quite a lot more now. And one of the, in a sort of slightly nerdy way, one of the most interesting things the Chancellor said is he was going to consult on changing the tax system, or at least the way in which we define what is self-employed or incorporated, in response to that. And that could, in the long run, have quite a big effect.
The OBR's inflation figures are interesting because compared to the Bank of England, they're not that bad. They've got inflation peaking at 2.5% in 2018, which if wage growth was to stay the way it is now, about 2.3%, it would just be a little bit above. Then it falls back down to 2%. If that's true, you wouldn't get the same squeeze on real living standards that many had feared because of the fall of the pound, and therefore maybe not the same impact on growth. It wouldn't be so bad.
Well, clearly the higher the inflation is, then the worse that is for living standards, and the OBR, along with the bank, is expecting a direct pass-through into higher prices. A bit less, but actually not that much less than the bank is expecting. And you know, if it does turn out that we get prices at 2.5% and wages at 2.3%, in historical terms, that's terrible. I mean, we usually see earnings rising 2% a year faster than prices, not 0.2% less fast than prices. And don't forget, I mean, we are, irrespective of what happened on June the 23rd, we've already had 7 or 8 years essentially with no growth in real earnings. And I haven't looked at I haven't looked at the specific numbers here, but it looks like we've got several more years of that, and we may well end up by the end of this decade with earnings no higher than they were at the beginning of the decade.
And that will have a huge impact on consumer spending.
Frankly, never seen that before, certainly not since the last war.
So is it clear from what you've been able to find out so far, for the just about managing, this new popular political phrase, is it clear that the just about managing are going to be any better off as a result of this?
There's not a lot here in terms of measures for that group. Now, we do, of course, have the national living wage rising to £7.50 an hour in April. That's quite a big increase on the minimum wage as it was a year ago, and that will help a lot in that group. Otherwise, we've got this small increase in the generosity of universal credit when it finally comes in, but nowhere near that's nowhere near offsets the cuts that were announced back in June 2015. No doubt we'll also be told that the, again, freezing fuel duties will help that group, though of course most of that money will go to better off people who tend to consume more fuel, more petrol. So there's not an enormous amount here, I think, for that just about managing group.
Paul, we need to leave it there, but we thank you for our initial, your initial reaction. We look forward to the more considered one tomorrow when you've had a chance to go through all the figures on that. Paul Johnson of the IFS there.